Welcome to another episode of Some Random Thoughts. I'm your host, Ryan Wilkowski, and on the program today, I have a very special guest. Her name is Meghan Crozier. Hey, Meghan. Thank you so much for being here. I first met her in a clubhouse room, Progressive Christians. It's a really large group, so if that is something that's of your interest, you should definitely go check that out. It's a wonderful room, lots of great people. They're doing lots of activity all the time there. But you can also find Meghan all over social media. So Meghan, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you like to talk about, and where people can find you?
Yeah, so I'm actually an elementary school teacher, but on the side, I am a writer, and I have loved kind of evolving and figuring out my voice in this space. I write about faith deconstruction. I identify as progressive Christian. My jam right now is probably Twitter. And I'm at the Pursuing Life, and I have started a Facebook group called The Pursuing Life, and it's Progressive Christians, Deconstruction, and More, it's called. And so I'm on Clubhouse, Facebook, Instagram, all the places under The Pursuing Life.
Awesome. Simple enough. So The Pursuing Life is where people can find you on the social media. Okay. Well, very good. So thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have you because you do speak a lot about what we're going to talk about on this episode. So, by the way, what we're doing is a revisit episode, and what that means is Meghan is going to be discussing, and I will be discussing a previous episode I did in season 1. So this episode is going to be on spirituality and deconstruction. So in season 1, which you can go check out wherever you get your podcasts, I talk about a lot about my story, talk about a lot about my religious upbringing and kind of my religious life, and then my deconstruction into where I am now. And then I share a little bit at the end about what deconstruction is, how do you move through it, what are some healthy ways, things like that. On this episode, you don't need to hear my story again. So Meghan is going to share her story about kind of her spiritual journey, kind of where she's been and what she talks about now, what she's passionate about. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what do we think deconstruction is, what's a good way to move through that process, why is the process happening in the first place, why is it becoming a bigger and bigger movement amongst so many people. And then we'll talk about we might have a little debate about, religion versus, non-religion, pros and cons, stuff like that. Maybe just to mix it up and shake it up a little bit, keep Meghan on her toes here. So,
Nice.
So Meghan, first of all, what I want to do is I want to give you lots of time, and I want you to just share about your spiritual journey, your religious background, and what are some of the changes that you've gone through throughout your life, and how did you navigate some of the difficulties and some of the positives of your journey?
Yeah, so I grew up evangelical. I grew up in the Midwest, and we went to a church that was non-denominational it was it actually, they did identify as evangelical free, but we really were modeled after like Willow Creek. We went to their conferences. We did all that. And so I grew up and went to a Christian college. I was the youth group leader, the student leader, and just very rule following. And when I was in college, I signed a pledge that I would be a missionary for a couple years after college. I studied Spanish. And so I had this kind of outline of my life. And I'm going to jump forward 20 years because as my faith ebbed and flowed throughout my life, when COVID hit, I had this kind of spiritual reckoning where I had this time in college where I had prayed for an hour a day for 2 years. And I started to kind of connect things that I had prayed for to things that happened years and years later. And so I spent a lot of COVID really walking through my journey from college, I say from college to COVID, and just really writing through all of those things. And I wrote this memoir that called Nothing is Impossible, the Memoir of Prayer. And I always like to say now that I'm deconstructing my memoir, because what happened is it like fit so perfectly and so nicely. And I have some stories about miracles and healing and answered prayers. And it just didn't sit right with me. I don't know, there were things in there. And then I would, like, as I traced back, and I wasn't I wasn't super generous about all of those things all the time because I do talk about purity culture and I talk about
Right.
what it was like in college to pine away for my spiritual leader to come show up and pursue me. And I
Mm,
talk about those things, but I also I didn't I wasn't as I I guess I wish I would have pushed back more while I was writing that. And everything just kind of ended in this nice, neat package. And I had beta readers read it and they were like, oh, this is so moving and so amazing. And your story is just so great. But I still had this discomfort. And at the time, I was super involved in a church. And so COVID was happening and I was watching church online. And that discomfort started to grow the more
mm,
I started to lean into like, wow, this church is, they just made it very clear how complementarian they are. And oh man, like they're talking about Black Lives Matter, but they are like very, very clear to say, like, we don't want to disrupt the nuclear family structure. And this is why. And I started to
yeah.
say, like, where is that discomfort coming from? And yeah, so I started to really dig in. And of course, it was, in the political climate that we're in too. And so there was a lot that I was reading a lot of books. And so yeah, I have a lot in that 20 years that now I look back and I'm like, what was that actually? Was that an answered prayer or was that just life or what happened there? So I can unpack as much as much of that as possible, but
Yeah. So it sounds like the 20-year period, which you describe as college to COVID, right? Um, did your deconstruction start like at COVID, or do you feel like maybe you were deconstructing for longer than that, but you didn't have a word for it, or you probably didn't know what you were experiencing, and so you maybe just chalked it up to growing pains in faith, or like when exactly do you feel like there was like a precipice moment for you, or do you feel like this was just like a really long, slow, gradual progression toward where you are today?
yeah, so I was always a little bit different and I felt that difference and it was because things bothered me that didn't bother other people. And
Mm.
so like when I was in college, I went to a protest about the war in Iraq, and I had
Wow.
friends that were like, and I was really down during that time, and I had friends that were like, why is this bothering you so much? It's happening not even here, and I was like, why is this not
Wow.
bothering you?
Wow. Yeah.
And so, yeah, like things like that, but I kind of just let it go. And I think what happened during COVID was I started to hear more stories and listen more. And I started to
Yeah.
realize that the reason that I was letting those things go was because I had the privilege to do that. And so,
Mm.
sure, I felt comfortable in evangelical spaces because I wasn't ordained and trying to preach. I was not I don't identify as queer. I wasn't from a marginalized community, and so I think
Yeah.
I stayed in that space for a really long time and didn't do the kind of digging in work that helped me to understand. So I wouldn't say I was full on identifying as in deconstruction until November, December. I mean, you could watch my Instagram that it starts to shift from Bible verses to like rainbows.
Interesting. So we even see that progression with you, even on social media, and you would see it on mine too. Obviously, you would actually even see my progression even from the last episode in season one to this episode, because I've made jumps even in the last year,
Mhm.
and a lot of that had to do with COVID. So in season one, I kind of said I was a Christian, but I really wasn't. I'm more like interfaith because of my background as a chaplain, and but now I'm like, well, I'm still a chaplain, and I would still be interfaith in providing that support to patients and families. I do it in the hospice setting, but personally, I wouldn't even consider myself a Christian anymore. And I've been saying for about the past year ish, give or take, that I'm an agnostic, atheist, humanist. And that resonates a lot better with me than me trying to hold on to a label
Yeah.
that I just couldn't hold on to anymore for lots of reasons. But getting back, so it seems like you were wrestling with things most people didn't want to wrestle with because maybe for whatever reason. Do you think that discontent um, is something that people can have and still be religious? Because I feel like a lot of people that have a lot of social discontent or a lot of cultural discontent, seem to just go in my direction more. They just seem to kind of just abandon it all and just say burn it down and let me just trudge on in another path. But you're someone who still identifies as a progressive Christian. So what is it about the Christian narrative or the Christian story, whatever you want to call it, um, that still compels you to still be drawn to that and still find whatever you get to structure meaning or purpose or just kind of an identity?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I ask myself that question sometimes. And so I would say, I always say I'm a progressive Christian today. I think that I really evolved out of what I believe has to be the the belief, the thing that people believe, or the truth. I think that as I look at those 20 years, as I look at my life, there are things that I really feel like were divine, were God,
Mm,
but I have not, there are pieces that I haven't touched, that I haven't gone back to, because it's so complicated in the sense of um, what was God and what was a manipulation of an experience
mm,
that was, I had a small group where we talked about prophecy a lot. I had people praying healing. I had a health issue with my daughter, and we prayed healing over her. And it was just a very confusing time trying to unpack and understand what that was. And so I've gone from undeniably God to I really do feel like God is in all of this and God is somewhere. And I felt like in the spectrum of progressive Christianity, I could live in that space and evolve and figure that out and work with it. But I did not get to a point where I was like, all right, this is all garbage and I'm just gonna walk
okay.
away. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, no, and that's what makes me having conversations with various different types of people so fascinating, because as someone who's kind of newly in the atheist humanist crowd, I'm new. I haven't been in that crowd that long, right? So I still wrestle from time to time with various different things. And I think the biggest thing I wrestle with now more than anything is my life before, like things that just seem to have lined up, or what
Mhm.
I would perceive as just things falling into place, still mess with me a great deal. Like,
Mhm.
I'm still kind of like, wow, there were moments that I could look back in my life and I just chalked it all up to God and it was so simple and it seems so just obvious. But now, because I'm just firmly in my belief that that's not true, I still don't have an explanation for why things lined up the way they did back when they did in my life. And so now I'm kind of like in this I don't know space, which I feel like is honest, but at the same time, it like messes with me. I'm just like, okay. Is there like a connectedness to something? What am I missing? Right? What am I not seeing? What am I not getting? And I think that there are some who probably still are frustrated with that. And you're on Twitter actively, I'm on Twitter actively, and you probably see a lot of atheist Twitter, just like I see atheist Twitter. And I know you engage really well with atheists and agnostics. I think just as much, probably, if not more, as Christians or other religious people. What what has been some of the most worthwhile conversations or worthwhile things you've learned from atheists or agnostics or people that don't identify the way you believe? What are some of the things that you've really been surprised about, taken aback about, or just kind of like, oh, wow, that's cool. And I'm so glad that I kind of learned that or experienced that.
Yeah, I want to answer that, but I do want to respond to what you said about trying to figure out like what things were,
Okay. Yeah.
because I would say that when I look back at my life and I look at I did not become a missionary after college. I became a bilingual elementary school teacher, and I did not marry the quote unquote spiritual leader that I thought I would. I married somebody that didn't grow up evangelical. And so when I look back at, I think this might have been God. It's the reason that I think that is because it's not what the evangelical church would have outlined for me. If they had scripted something, it would not have matched that script. And I
Uh,
ended up in the Pacific Northwest, like very, far from my roots, but in a place that I love and feel
mhm.
free. And so I think that um, when I that's just interesting to me to think, yeah, trying to separate what was kind of the narrative that I was of things I was supposed to do or should have done versus what actually happened. So I just wanted to say I think about that a lot. But as far as hanging out with atheists and agnostics, I feel so safe with y'all. Like I don't know. I feel like I can put out on Twitter and say, man, it's been a rough day. And I will have my atheist and agnostic friends send me a DM or a text message and say, like, hey, like, are you okay? I saw what you tweeted out. Like, what's going on? Do you need to talk? And I will have my Christian friends, bless their hearts, will say, I'll be praying. And it's like,
Yeah.
like that's awesome. Like pray, that's cool. But like you don't know what's going on. How are you praying for me, really? Like
Yeah.
what are you
Right.
praying about? And I do have friends that I will ask, will you pray for me about this or whatever? But when somebody just jumps in with that, I'll be praying, oh God, I shared recently that I was having a conflict with a friend and somebody was like, you should pray for her. That would make everything better. And I was like, I don't think that's going to help. Like, I really don't. And so my atheist and agnostic friends would never say that. They're just real
No.
people. And
Yeah.
it's faith is not the foundation of our friendship. It's like, we're just friends. Like,
Yeah.
and we talk about all this stuff and that's cool. But like, there's no directive of did you have a quiet time this morning? Because I think maybe you would have less anxiety if you had prayed, I don't know.
It's reminding me of the things that I grew up with as well. And part of the reasons why I just felt compelled to like really deconstruct is because I was given such like cliche, convenient answers that never seemed to be a good solution. And so for me, it was like finding like human answers to my human problems
Yes.
was so much more helpful than trying to find religious answers to my human problems. And then there's moments where I connected with, like, I could connect with the story of Jesus somewhat because in his humanness, it was like, yeah, I can understand why Jesus would be under great anguish and have anxiety because he was about to die. I could understand that he would flip the tables at the temple because of the infusion of greed in a space that's supposed to be sacred, right? Like, so a lot of the humanness of Jesus, like, it made sense. And at the same time, Jesus seemed so inaccessible to me when he was really talking about like the supposed divine self. And I'm like, I don't understand that. And how, if I can't understand it and I'm born in a time where I feel like knowledge is just so much more vast, how are these like 12 men who come from very lowly backgrounds 2000 plus years ago, how are they going to possibly understand like these existential things, right? And so it's like I wrestled even with the narrative of Jesus. And I still struggle with the narratives of the Bible in general and Jesus not speaking about certain things or speaking on certain things that just seemed questionable. But I'm so glad that you talked about how one thing that you really felt like with atheists and agnostics or non-spiritual people is that you feel safe because you felt like people actually listen to you. Is that a fair statement? Like you feel listened, you don't feel like you're being talked to or people are
Yeah.
trying to fix it. You just feel like people are just trying to bear witness and be in solidarity with you and listen to you. And it seems like for you and things that have happened in your life, that seems to give you a lot more comfort than maybe trying to get the pat answer or the cliche answer or a convenient answer. Would that be fair
Yeah, and I
to say?
think listening without judgment too, because I think I still in Christian spaces get a lot of that, like, why is this bothering you? Why
Mm,
are you bothered by the idea of, you know, why are you bothered? Why are you bothered by complementarianism? Why are you bothered by, and so I don't get that judgment in other spaces. And I will say that most of my atheist and agnostic friends are people that have deconstructed out of faith. And so they hold space for me in a much different way than I don't know. I would imagine somebody that hasn't gone through kind of that same journey that
yeah.
I've been through. Although that being said, I've never met an atheist or agnostic that I haven't gotten along pretty well with. So
Oh,
I
good.
don't
That's
know. Like
good. Batting a
but
thousand. Go atheists. Go agnostics. Proud of you all. Awesome. Glad to hear it. If there's ever anyone that tries to just like mess with you, you let me know. We'll
yeah,
get we'll
thanks.
get your atheism. We'll pounce on that person.
Yeah.
But no, I'm really glad to hear that. That's the I think that was the struggle for me too. Is I felt like I dealt with a lot of stress and a lot of issues, and I just felt like people were just not listening. Like people just did not do a good job listening, like you said, and specifically listening without judgment.
And without an agenda too.
Correct. Correct. And I feel like even in some of the clubhouse spaces, the very, very Christian ones, not necessarily the one that you moderate, but I've been in like other ones just to check them out. And it's like the lack of just awareness about trying to be respectful of people's stories is just really baffling to me. And it's really frustrating that people
Yeah.
just can't take 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 30 seconds just to listen, that they feel like they always have to say something, and they always feel like they have to have an agenda. And that's one of the struggles that I still have with like many religious people, not all religious people, but many, is that I feel like every time someone wants to reach out from my past, I'm already so cynical because I feel like they're reaching out because they want to bring me back, not
Yeah.
because they really want to know how I'm doing, not because they really care to know how I'm doing. It's more like, hey, it's been a long time. And then at first they're trying to like soften it and make it sound like they really care. And then they're like, but what happened here? I read this or I heard that. And like, I don't understand. And then they try to like do this like whole like evangelism thing with me, and I'm just like, no, like stop. Like
Yeah.
I said what I said and I believe what I believe, and I don't need you to go there with me. What are some of the things that frustrate you about Christianity the most? That's gonna be a really long answer probably for you. But just start
You
like
know,
doing a checklist. Like what are some of
I
the things
think
that really get you hot, like really grind your gears and really
I
want you to
think
just like shout?
Christians. Like I think I really like
Okay.
and I think back and I'll tell you a little bit. I'll give you a couple examples, but when I graduated from college, so when I was in college, I had I dated a couple guys that went on to be pastors, and they were jerks. And I was
Hmm.
like, this is supposed to be my spiritual leader. And I had mentors that were like, yeah, relationships are hard. And if you fight, like, that's okay. Fight, like people fight when they get married. Like that's cool. And I was like, but I don't know. We fight a lot. Like I don't know if this, and I really think I worked extra hard to make those relationships work because I thought, oh, this is like what God wants for me. And then on top of that, I had some issues with a church that I was involved with, and when I left, I graduated, and I had gone this. I'll try to tell this concisely, but I had been one of those people that thought like drinking was really bad and you should never ever drink. And
Yeah.
like I would categorize people into like you're a drinker and you're a non-drinker. And I was like 20 when I was doing this. So I was like, it doesn't even matter. Like I'm not even old enough to be legally drinking. But yet, so I remember I had this switch after I graduated and I went to a graduation party. I had a Mike's Hard Lemonade and I was like, wait a second. Like this is not the most evil thing that's ever happened to me. And so, but at the time I was in this process of becoming a missionary. Like
Mm.
I was going through the stages. I had a church sponsored me and I was going through this process. And I got to the very last step. And it was you were supposed to meet with a therapist and they were supposed to give you the go ahead. Okay, so you fill out this evaluation before you go to the appointment. I went there and I sat with this woman and she asked me if I've ever drank before. And I was like, I used to not drink, but now I occasionally will have a beer. And she was like, she spent the entire session reaming me out. And she said, you have a problem. You're an
What?
alcoholic. You
Huh?
should at least detox for 6 months before you would ever go to Ecuador. And really, I was
She really a
praying.
therapist? I'm starting to feel like I'm not getting therapist vibes. I'm getting like uber biblical counselor, and she's calling herself a
Yeah.
therapist kind of vibe.
I looked her up recently. She's retired, but and she I found
Does
a
she
picture
have a
of her.
license though?
She had a glass of wine at an art gallery and on the picture on Google,
Of
and I
course
was
she
like,
did.
okay, finally. But no, so she ruined me for like years because I thought I internalized what she said, and I
Of
was like, I have a
course.
problem. I'm a
Yeah.
sinner. I'm a horrible person, and I feel like it. That happens. And I think in evangelicalism, it's like this culture that perpetuates things like that happening. There's
Mhm.
nobody preaching on Sunday mornings that say like, go give really bad therapy and like direct people's life. I mean, she changed my life because I at the time was going to
Wow.
be a missionary and I did not become a missionary. And in my memoir, I healed, like writing through that process. I really felt a lot of healing because at the time, for years and decades, I thought I really blew it and I went against what God wanted for me. I had signed this pledge to become a missionary and I did not do that. And so like I always lived with this like small piece of shame of like
Mm.
I don't I think that this is not the path God wanted for me, and had I become a missionary, like maybe my life would have been different. Like I had this, but now looking back I'm like no, I was never supposed to be a missionary. And so I think but
Right.
the church is right for that. Like these directions because they have this leadership of like listen to people that speak truth into your life. This is God's will for you. This is the pastor, the mentor, the therapist, all these people. And I don't know. I just think it provides an environment that can easily turn harmful and toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as an ex-clergy person, for me, I felt like the majority of the pastors that I either worked with or just met through just being in church world for a long time, were completely narcissistic and completely judgmental and had this God complex, like a superiority complex that was just so obvious that it really sickened me. And and I think that's why I didn't get along with pastors, being a pastor. And I think it's why I didn't have a good experience being a pastor in the 10 years I was a pastor. I didn't ever have a really healthy church experience in the 10 years that I worked in the church. And I can out of all the churches I've attended in my life, I think I can only name one church where I had somewhat of a healthy experience, and it was like the only church that I did not work in. I was
Yeah.
like just going to church and that was it. I wasn't even volunteering. It was like at a moment in my life, I'm like, I don't want to volunteer. I don't want to do anything. This is back when I was still kind of holding on to a progressive Christian identity. So I was like, I don't want to do anything. I just want to like go and like sing some songs and like listen to the sermon and maybe feel connected, maybe, and then go home. Like I just was burned out. And that was the only healthy church experience I had. And it's because I think just like I said, I mean, a lot of the pastoral identity is really, really troubling. They just hold like really unhealthy views of themselves. And it's kind of easy whenever you're thinking that God is speaking directly to you through the Holy Spirit and you got a word for so many people. And the larger the church you have, and if it's growing and things are on the outside perceived to look really well, I mean, it's going to boost your ego. And so you get
Well,
this egotistical thing too.
and you're right about everything when you're the pastor.
Right.
You're right about everything.
Yeah,
And
you
so if
can't be
somebody comes,
wrong.
yeah. So you
Can't
really
lead
have.
people astray. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I remember my pastor describing why my former pastor, why our church was complementarian. And he was like, yeah, this is just one of those things that you wish wasn't in the Bible, but it is, and I was like, that's a really great cop out for you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. It's really easy when you're a guy and
yeah,
you have a penis, to
yeah.
say that, so yeah.
But you just touched on something, and I don't mean to ask the questions, but you said that when you were part of that community or that church that you had the good experience with, you
Yeah.
did it to feel connected, and you talked about that in your podcast too, because I
Yeah.
think that's a huge part of what pulls us in is the
Hmm.
community you find in church spaces, and
Yeah.
that community happens to revolve around a lot of beliefs, and some people, I mean some people get so stuck on the black and whiteness of it when it's
Yeah.
so not black and white. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm in the Southeast, right? So the culture in the South is so different than in other parts of the country because I've seen Christianity and specifically evangelical Christianity permeate every single facet of social life growing up. I mean, you
Yeah.
had evangelical movements happening in public schools, you had them happening in public governments, you had them happening in almost every business, you had it in neighborhoods, you had it in obviously churches are like on every single corner. Uh, it's like you couldn't escape. It's like if you're in the South, you can't escape Christianity. Like you just, it's so permeated and so intertwined in everything that to not be a Christian and to be in the South is just like extremely difficult. And I think that's why maybe for so long I held on to
Hmm.
a Christian identity, even when it didn't resonate with me, just because I knew of all the social implications that were going to happen when I said, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I'm not going to be a part of this anymore.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to lose everything, and I almost did lose everything. I didn't lose everything, but I was really close. I mean, I've lost
Hmm.
the majority of my friends. I've lost um, my identity, because my identity was wrapped up in being a pastor, which meant being a Christian, which meant ministry, which meant everything. Like my whole life was in the church, right? So to leave
Yeah.
that, it's like it was all gone. Like, and so um, and I know you're in the Pacific Northwest, so like what does Christianity look like in the Pacific Northwest? Is it as intertwined as it is in other parts of the country, or is there like good healthy separation between maybe state and church and business and church? And so what does it look like for you up there?
I think the vibe that I get is that it's just real hip. Like it's like we can talk about church at a brewery and that, like we're going to have a really good beer and talk church like that. And it's like, ooh, you talk about, beer at a pub, cool, and so I think that's how it is in the Pacific Northwest where they try to be super hip or they try to be super against everything about the
Mm-hmm.
Pacific Northwest, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, like marijuana just became legal. There's breweries and wineries everywhere, and it's just like this culture of like, people think, oh, like let's go anti-cultural and just be these lights, quote unquote, light in the darkness of this Pacific Northwest heathenism or whatever. So I think it goes one of two ways.
I mean, is that even accurate though, in your opinion? Do you really feel like it's like, is it that secular, or is there still a really strong religious presence in the Pacific Northwest?
I mean,
Or
I
is
don't
it
know
just
if
like, is it just really, really hard to nail down? Is it just really like city by city or community by community or?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it is. Like, I don't know if I have a wide enough understanding of what it is, to be able to fully answer that question. But I will say that when we moved out here, my husband and I, we've been to almost every church in our like local area.
Okay.
And I mean, we went to 6 churches in 8 weeks, and I mean, just to check them all out. And
Yeah.
it was just fascinating to see what's happening in churches out here. That was, 10 years ago, but and we've been to different ones that are, and you kind of saw it with COVID, because it's like some churches opened up right away or tried to never close. Some church, the church I've been kind of connected with, the progressive faith community, they've never gone back in person yet, and I feel
Mm.
super comfortable with that. And so I mean, I think it was just, we're going to draw this line for Jesus and COVID or whatever it is, I don't know. So
It's just interesting. One of the things I've been fascinated about is just the societal and anthropological implications of religion. And so I just kind of wanted to ask you, like, is it unfair to just be one extreme or the other when it comes to religion? So for me, in the atheist space, there's a huge divide of multiculturalism, including like being tolerant of religious presence and its identity, versus the atheists and agnostics that just are like, burn it down. Like, I wish there was no religion. We need to get rid of all religion. Religion is toxic. It does nothing but harm. Um, how do you feel about kind of the warring faction that you see between like the people that just want to like get rid of religion altogether, and then the ones who are trying to make space for religion, but they want accountability and they want better for religion?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I am not super steeped in that world of like those warring factions and atheism. So I don't know if I can speak to that. I will speak, and this might be a little offshoot of your question, but I
Okay.
will speak to, because I do think that that's happening within evangelicalism, because I think there's this like this movement of like the new re-evangelical
Yeah, that's a
or
good point. Yeah,
whatever.
talk about that actually. I've seen this revangelical thing pop up on Twitter and I am very confused. So I would
Yeah.
love for you to give your expert advice and insight into what is revangelical and what's going on there.
Well, and I think I keep them at an arm's length always, always. And I think what I'm seeing is there's people that are kind of like, what is happening with these people that are saying evangelical and deconstruction? And so they start to kind of look at some of the tweets or the blog posts or, the stories, and then they kind of think, oh, we're going to be different. And then they kind of just, I always call it like the Hunger Games. You create a new version of the same bad
Mm,
thing,
yeah,
And so it's like really what it is a way to say, okay, we want to hold space for you to have doubts and deconstruct or whatever you need to do. But then in the end, like, we're going to catch you here and we're going to tell you, like, we're just going to catch you and hope and tell you that this is where you should land because ultimately this is the truth. And it's like, no, 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 no. Like, we're deconstructing out of that and
yeah.
we're figuring out our own journeys and everything else. And so I think I've been pretty leery, and I get real ranty real fast when people start to give hot takes on what's happening in the deconstruction world that are not in that world. So,
Yeah, and I've noticed that too. That's been really frustrating for me is that you have a lot of evangelicals who are talking about ex-evangelicals or ex-evangelicals or the deconstructing community, but first of all, they have no understanding of it, and second of all, they won't talk with anybody who has gone through that experience. So they're only talking from like the outside looking in. They're not gaining an intimate perspective of things, and so they either straw man or they just stereotype or they use it as a prop or an illustration to embolden their own bigoted, narrow-minded views of themselves and their beliefs to make themselves feel better. And I've seen that a lot. So I've seen like evangelicals go, oh, so this person is an ex-evangelical now, or they're an agnostic now, or they're an atheist now. Well, they were never a Christian in the first place, or well, that person's going to hell, or like just whatever they want to say, whatever like nasty thing they want to say. Um, but every single ex-evangelical and deconstructing person that I know that came from conservative evangelicalism or fundamentalism were sincere when they were in that space. So for you to
yes.
go, they're being insincere or they weren't actually true to the faith in the first place is just disingenuous.
Yeah, and I would also say, so have you read Jesus and John Wayne?
No, not yet. I need to.
Yeah, so but that's a really good critique of like how patriarchy perpetuated like evangelicalism and where it is today. And a lot of people said, the kind of the solution is a church called Tove by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer. And Scott McKnight was one of my college professors.
Mm,
He's egalitarian. I have a lot of good things to say about Scott McKnight, but I started reading the book and I just felt this like, because basically the thesis is church needs goodness and tov, and they need like the Mr. Rogers like goodness. And like you said, it doesn't cover it all. It doesn't tell the whole
mm,
picture. It doesn't have the whole
yeah.
story. And so like what they did was they would take churches like Willow Creek and Mars Hill and talk about like Mark Driscoll and like, oh yeah, he was a narcissist, and really say like that was a bad church, and like this is what you need to have a good church. And I was like, no, like that, like evangelicalism is bad and this is why. That's what I
Yeah.
want to say. And I think I get into those conversations a lot because I get pushback. I get, "Yeah, you can't generalize all evangelicals." And I'm like, all evangelicals maintain a sexual ethic that you have to be abstinent until you're
Correct.
married, and like
Right.
like there are certain things that yes you can say about all evangelicals, and there are certain things that you can unpack that was harmful within evangelicalism. And so I think
Correct.
it is, it's uh, I've had conversations with friends before that have kind of pointed out, it's kind of like when you talk about the police and you say like, but there's one good cop, like what about this one good, and it's like, no, but the system is bad. Like you need to really look at how the system is bad.
Hmm.
And so I think that's what I say when people give their hot takes or do the evangelical. I'm like, but like, have you really looked into how the system is bad? Because it doesn't look like you have.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. I feel like some of that, oh, this church is bad, but our church is good, is just being like dismissive, and it's a
Hmm.
it's a constant dismissive attitude that I see amongst some Christians, many Christians, even progressive Christians. Honestly, I know some atheists that are just as angry and frustrated with progressive Christianity as they are with evangelical Christianity, and maybe more so. I know a
I'm
couple.
listening. Tell me more. That's
Yeah, so
fine.
I know a couple who are really upset at progressive Christianity because they see it as a cop out. They see it as kind of like having your cake and eating it too. It's like, okay, so you can do all the reformations so one person said it this way, and I kind of laughed a little bit, I have to say. One person said progressive Christianity is just humanism with Jesus, and it's dismissing Jesus of all the problematic things that Jesus espoused or didn't say. And it's like keeping the good. It's kind of like the Jefferson Bible of the 21st century is progressive Christianity. How Thomas Jefferson famously cut out all the parts he didn't like, and he kept the parts he did like, and he was left with like a sliver of the entire book because that's all he could find that he could like. How
Hmm.
would you respond to someone if someone had a conversation with you and said, religion is toxic, burn it to the ground? Why are you still maintaining that kind of identity or space? Or what would your be like rebuttal to that would be? Like, what are some of the redeeming qualities that you feel like are there? Or what are some of the things that maybe we're missing, especially the antagonistic and maybe agnostics or atheists who are just like, now progressive Christianity is just as bad as like evangelical Christianity, is just as bad as like any religion, especially religions that have proposed, endorsed slavery and genocidal violence and lots of other things that are just really hard to explain or really problematic.
Yeah. So there's there's probably going to be a lot that I agree with those people about. I don't, and I so I think that I don't know if I'm in a space to really defend it to the end because I am still evolving where like what I believe and what I think. But I guess the way that you laid it out as far as the critique that you said, I think I look at it that same way as like we're stripping away, like we're kind of holding on to some things and stripping away other things, but the way that I look at it is really from my own personal experience. And that is like within evangelicalism, like what I'm trying to strip away isn't just like what I just don't like. It's more what I thought was kind of a manipulation or an interpretation based on this evangelical way. And so what I'm trying to figure out is like what was this white evangelical American Christianity and like what wasn't. And so I think that's what I'm trying to filter or sift through. And I know I have a lot of work to do about decolonization too, because I totally see that and I am listening to the
Yeah.
voices that are speaking in that space too. But yeah, I think I do look when I see pushback because I see words like fundamental or progressive fundamentalists, I
Correct.
think.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so yeah, and I think I'm like, oh, that is so interesting. And I've heard, recently I was in a discussion about, hey, there's this new purity culture and it's progressives that are coming out like, hey, we want to make sure that we're pure and don't ever come across as anything that could be associated with this, that, or this, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, that is actually a really good point that happens. So I think I actually often agree with people more than but I, I don't know. And I think because I'm holding it loosely, I don't feel as like it's fragile for me to hear pushback on that.
It's a good point. Okay. So for those who are just would just like what I did with you and your gracious response. So for someone who did have a gracious response, it's because you think they're probably just holding on to it a lot more tightly, or they just have never gotten pushback maybe before and they don't know how to handle it. I know that that's happened to me, even when I try to be as gracious as possible in presenting the argument. uh, you're still going to set people off. And I think it's because
Yeah.
it's such a personal thing too. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes we forget about that and we tend to intellectualize everything. And we have to remember that religion is an extremely personal experience. It's also a communal one, and it's a sociological one. So that means like there has to be some there has to be some accountability of how we live our lives anyway, whatever our religious or non-religious belief is. I'm going to give you the last word. So what is it that you want to share? What encouraging words do you want to share for the listeners, those who are religious, those who are not religious? What are some of the most important things in your heart right now that you just feel like, I just really wish people could get this. I really wish people could live like that. I really wish people would understand this about progressive Christianity. I really wish people would be more sensitive about this with my atheist and agnostic friends that I have. What are some of the things that you want to leave with us?
Um, I would say validation of somebody's journey, I think, is so critical. I think I've had people say, like, I think you need to find your personal happiness. And I'm like, I am happy. I'm good, but I think they see my critique of things, or they see me ranting and raving, and there's freedom in the vulnerability of being able to say, like, really, really say how you feel and really articulate it. And I think I don't see it as sad. I don't see it as lost. I see it as, finding my way and just traveling on a journey. And I just would hope that everyone holds each other's journey with this validity of, like, this is your journey. You've had all of this life experience that's led to your journey. And so, like, that, like this, like, tell me more, And so I think, instead of holding a belief about what somebody's journey is or should look like, I think it's just so important to validate the journey that somebody is on, even if it's a different journey, even if it seems like a journey you wouldn't agree with, I think, just to validate that journey. And I will say, I'm learning that about evangelicals too, because I think that's the weakness of mine, that I'm like, burn it all down, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think the hope in that is just seeing people hold space for me and have grace, yeah, and validating my journey. And I think we have to do that for ourselves too, because I think deconstruction is hard. It's hard to evolve an identity that you've had for decades and figure it out. And so, yeah, we need people to do it to help validate us, but we also need to validate it within ourselves, and just have so much care and tenderness for our own journeys, because that can be hard.
Thank you so much, Meghan Crozier, the Pursuing Life. You can find her everywhere: Clubhouse, Twitter, Instagram. Your website
I
is the
probably, and yeah, I should have mentioned my blog. That's
yeah,
that's where
I
I
was about to
drop
say
my
your website is
writing. So,
thepursuinglife.com, right?
yep, yeah.
Okay.
So,
She's written lots of good stuff recently on her website, in particularly toxic positivity, getting a lot of attention all over Twitter. She has a lot of good insights about that and much more. Meghan, once again, thank you so much for being on Some Random Thoughts with me. I really appreciate all your insights, and I appreciate your friendship. And thank you for all the work that you do, especially on Clubhouse. Go check out the Progressive Christians group on Clubhouse if you're on there. It's a wonderful group. They meet quite often. I usually attend the Thursday evening group. And yes, it's not just for progressive Christians, post-Christians too. I'm a post-Christian, I'm an atheist, and yet some of the best people that I have met recently on the internet are in that group. So go check it out. Meghan, once again, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. This was fun.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all for listening. And you only have one life. Make the most of it. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.